Welcome to Compact Disasters from CompactHistories.com, where we look at catastrophes, accidents, and natural disasters in short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 69, the Love Canal disaster. The story of the Love Canal disaster begins decades before chemical contamination entered public awareness, rooted instead in a failed engineering scheme and a growing industrial city. Love Canal is located in Niagara Falls, New York, a city whose rapid expansion in the early 20th century was driven by cheap hydroelectric power and a booming chemical industry. The canal itself was the idea of William T. Love, a real estate developer and entrepreneur. In the 1890s, Love proposed constructing a canal to connect the Niagara River to Lake Ontario, creating a model industrial city powered by hydroelectricity. Construction began in 1894, but the project quickly collapsed due to financial difficulties and the economic disruption caused by the Panic of 1893. Only a partially dug canal, roughly 3,000 feet long, was completed before work ceased. The trench filled with water, debris, and refuse, becoming a physical reminder of an abandoned ambition. For decades, the unfinished canal sat largely unused. By the 1920s, the surrounding land was being repurposed for residential development as Niagara Falls expanded. The canal trench itself was gradually filled in, leveled, and forgotten by many residents. There was little public memory of its origins, and no indication that it would later become one of the most infamous environmental disaster sites in American history. After the Second World War, demand for housing increased sharply. Niagara Falls, like many industrial cities, experienced population growth as returning soldiers started families and sought affordable homes. By the 1950s, Love Canal was firmly established as a working-class neighbourhood. Streets were laid out, homes were built, and a school was planned close to the former canal route. Crucially, Love Canal was never treated as hazardous land. There were no warning signs, no restrictions on development, and no systematic environmental assessments. The canal's failed industrial past was regarded as irrelevant, its physical presence erased beneath layers of soil and construction. By the time families began moving into the neighbourhood in large numbers, Love Canal appeared ordinary and safe. Children played in gardens and schoolyards, unaware that the ground beneath them held a legacy that had never been properly closed, sealed, or understood. The disaster that would later emerge did not arrive suddenly. It had been quietly embedded in the landscape from the moment an abandoned canal was mistaken for suitable ground on which to build a community. The transformation of Love Canal from an abandoned trench into a toxic hazard began during the Second World War. In 1942, the Hooker Electrochemical Company, later known as Hooker Chemical, began using the partially excavated canal as a disposal site for industrial waste. The decision was driven by wartime demand, limited disposal options, and the convenient isolation of the unused canal trench. Over the next 11 years until 1953, Hooker Chemical dumped an estimated 21,000 tons of chemical waste into Love Canal. The materials included a wide range of substances used in plastics, rubber, dyes, solvents, and pesticides. Among them were benzene, chloroform, toluene, chlorinated hydrocarbons, and residues associated with the manufacture of DDT and other synthetic compounds. Many of these chemicals were known to be hazardous, even by the standards of the time. Waste was deposited in metal drums and bulk loads, layered into the canal and periodically covered with soil. As dumping progressed, the trench was gradually filled to ground level. In 1953, Hooker Chemical capped the site with clay and soil, believing this would isolate the waste from the surface. The canal was then considered closed. No long-term containment system was installed, and no plan was made for monitoring chemical migration. That same year, Hooker Chemical sold the land to the Niagara Falls Board of Education for $1. The deed included a written warning that the property contained buried chemical waste and a disclaimer releasing the company from future liability. Despite this, construction proceeded. An elementary school was built directly on top of the former canal, and residential development expanded around it. At the time, burying chemical waste was not illegal, and environmental regulation was minimal. There were no federal laws governing hazardous waste disposal, no requirement for environmental impact assessments, and little understanding of how chemicals could migrate through soil and groundwater over time. The clay cap was assumed to be sufficient, even though the area's high water table and seasonal freeze-thaw cycles posed clear risks to its integrity. By the mid-1950s, Love Canal had been transformed once again, this time from an industrial dumping ground into the foundation of a neighbourhood. The chemicals beneath the surface remained unseen and unmonitored, sealed away by assumption rather than certainty. The legacy left behind was not immediate or explosive, but it was dangerously incomplete, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to surface. By the early 1970s, the buried chemical legacy of Love Canal was beginning to break through the assumptions that had kept it hidden. Residents started to notice strange and troubling changes in their neighbourhood. After periods of heavy rain or snowmelt, chemical odours rose from the ground. Oily residues surfaced in gardens and basements. Puddles appeared with an unnatural sheen, and patches of grass died without explanation. Children were often the first to be affected. They returned home with chemical burns on their hands and legs after playing outside. Parents reported rashes, headaches, nausea, and persistent respiratory problems. Pets fell ill or died unexpectedly. Inside homes, sump pumps brought up discoloured water, and basement walls seeped with foul-smelling liquids. What had once seemed like isolated oddities began to form a pattern. Medical concerns soon followed. Local doctors observed unusually high rates of miscarriages, birth defects, and neurological problems among residents. While definitive links were difficult to prove at the time, the clustering of illnesses in a small geographic area raised serious concern. Residents suspected the land itself was making them sick, but early complaints were often dismissed as anecdotal or unscientific. The turning point came with the work of Lois Gibbs, a local resident whose son attended the elementary school built on the former canal site. After her child developed chronic health problems, Gibbs began investigating the area's history. She uncovered documents confirming that the neighbourhood had been built on a chemical dumping ground and organised residents to demand answers. In 1976, the New York State Department of Health conducted preliminary testing and found elevated levels of toxic chemicals in soil and air samples. The findings confirmed that the clay cap had failed and that chemicals were migrating through the ground into homes and public spaces. Despite this, official responses were slow and cautious. Authorities debated the level of risk, the cost of relocation, and who bore responsibility. By the late 1970s, Love Canal was no longer a local mystery. It had become a visible environmental crisis, driven not by a single spill or explosion, but by decades of buried waste slowly escaping into daily life. The alarms raised by residents marked the moment when Love Canal shifted from neglected history to national concern, setting the stage for confrontation, evacuation, and lasting political change. By 1978, the situation at Love Canal had reached a breaking point. What residents had been reporting for years was now supported by state and federal data, and the scale of contamination could no longer be contained by cautious language or incremental action. Tests conducted by the New York State Department of Health identified more than 80 chemical compounds in the area, including several known or suspected carcinogens. Air samples inside homes showed toxic vapors, and soil testing confirmed widespread contamination beyond the original canal trench. In April 1978, New York State Commissioner of Health Robert Whalen declared Love Canal a public health emergency, citing a significantly elevated risk of birth defects and miscarriages. Pregnant women and children under the age of 2 were advised to leave the area immediately. This marked one of the first times in U.S. history that a neighbourhood was officially deemed unfit for habitation due to chemical contamination. The declaration triggered intense public reaction. Residents, led by Lois Gibbs and the Love Canal Homeowners Association, organised protests, press conferences, and direct confrontations with officials. Media coverage spread rapidly, transforming Love Canal into a national symbol of environmental neglect. Images of families abandoning homes, children wearing face masks, and chemical waste surfacing in back gardens appeared across television and newspapers. In August 1978, New York Governor Hugh Carey ordered the evacuation of 239 families living closest to the canal and announced a state-funded buyout of their homes. That same month, President Jimmy Carter approved federal disaster assistance, an unprecedented move for a non-natural disaster. Federal funds were allocated for relocation, temporary housing, and further environmental investigation. Despite these actions, many residents remained trapped in limbo. Evacuation zones were drawn in stages, leaving some families inside contaminated areas while their neighbours were relocated. Arguments over property values, compensation, and eligibility created deep divisions within the community. Trust in authorities eroded as timelines slipped and promises changed. By 1980, a second larger evacuation was ordered, ultimately relocating more than 800 families. Love Canal had shifted from a local health crisis to a national policy failure, exposing gaps in environmental regulation, emergency response, and corporate accountability. The events of 1978 forced the government at every level to confront a reality it had long avoided. Industrial contamination could destroy communities just as thoroughly as floods, fires, or storms, and without clear legal frameworks, the damage was harder to stop and far slower to undo. As evacuations expanded and evidence of contamination mounted, attention shifted from emergency response to accountability. Residents wanted to know how a neighbourhood could be built on top of a chemical dump, who had allowed it to happen, and who would pay for the damage. Love Canal became a legal and political battleground, testing the limits of existing environmental law in the United States. The primary focus fell on Hooker Chemical, by then a subsidiary of Occidental Petroleum. The company argued that its actions had been legal at the time, that the waste had been properly buried, and that responsibility lay with those who later disturbed the site during construction. Hooker pointed to the 1953 deed, which explicitly warned of buried chemicals and disclaimed future liability. State and federal authorities countered that the company had failed to ensure long-term containment and had disposed of hazardous materials without adequate safeguards. Residents filed lawsuits seeking compensation for health problems, lost property value, and emotional distress. These cases dragged on for years, complicated by the difficulty of proving direct causation between specific chemicals and individual illnesses. Nonetheless, in 1983, Occidental Petroleum agreed to a $20 million settlement with the state of New York to cover cleanup costs without admitting liability. Additional settlements followed, including compensation for evacuated families. Beyond the courtroom, Love Canal had a profound legislative impact. The disaster exposed a fundamental gap in U.S. law. There was no comprehensive system for identifying, cleaning up, and assigning responsibility for abandoned hazardous waste sites. In response, Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, in December 1980, commonly known as Superfund. CERCLA created a federal program to clean up contaminated sites and established the principle that polluters could be held financially responsible, even decades after the pollution occurred. It allowed the government to act first and litigate later, a crucial shift from the paralysis seen at Love Canal. The law also introduced strict, joint, and retroactive liability, meaning companies could be held responsible regardless of intent or compliance with past regulations. Love Canal became the defining case that justified Superfund's existence. It demonstrated that environmental disasters did not always arrive suddenly, and that without strong legal tools, communities could be left trapped between corporate defences and regulatory inertia. Accountability, while imperfect and delayed, had finally been forced into law. The long aftermath of Love Canal unfolded over decades, shaped by clean-up efforts, political debate, and the uneasy question of whether a poisoned neighbourhood could ever be made safe again. Following the evacuations of the late 1970s and early 1980s, the area was largely abandoned. Homes were boarded up, streets fell silent, and Love Canal became a national shorthand for environmental failure. Clean-up formally began in the early 1980s under the newly established Superfund program. Engineers constructed a complex containment system designed to isolate the buried waste rather than remove it entirely. This included a drainage network to collect contaminated groundwater, a leachate treatment facility, and a reinforced clay and synthetic cap to prevent further chemical migration. By 1988, the primary remediation work was declared complete, at a cost of more than $400 million in state and federal funds. With containment in place, the question of resettlement emerged. Large sections of the neighbourhood closest to the canal were permanently demolished and fenced off, but areas farther away were reassessed. In the mid-1990s, after additional testing and monitoring, New York State declared parts of Love Canal safe for habitation. The area was renamed Black Creek Village in an effort to distance it from the stigma of the past, and some homes were sold to new residents at reduced prices. The decision to allow people to return was controversial. Critics argued that containment was not the same as removal and that long-term risks remained uncertain. Supporters pointed to extensive monitoring data showing reduced exposure levels and emphasized the need to reclaim abandoned urban land. Even today, Love Canal remains under continuous environmental monitoring, a reminder that the site is managed rather than cured. The broader legacy of Love Canal lies less in the neighbourhood itself and more in the policies it transformed. It reshaped how governments respond to slow-moving, human-made disasters, established the principle of long-term corporate liability, and embedded environmental health into public policy. Love Canal proved that contamination does not fade with time, and that the costs of ignoring it compound across generations. What began as a failed canal became a defining lesson. Not all disasters arrive with noise and destruction. Some seep quietly upward, forcing society to decide whether it will act only when the ground itself begins to make people sick. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Disasters, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes. And consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactdisasters.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, true crime, warfare, and mysteries. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/disasterscoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.